The world around us is hostile to the Word of God and to biblical values, but we are called to be salt and light, to stand for truth in a decaying culture. We are not called to run from the fire, but be willing to step into the fire. God has placed you at this time in history on purpose and for a purpose. Join us as we get better equipped to address civics and culture from a biblical worldview. Welcome to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church. Let's welcome our hosts Alison Furno and Debi Vandenboom.
Today's topic is why Christians should be involved in civics. Debi and I are going to have a really fun and interesting discussion about this and really talk about kind of how we started getting involved in the first place. So, Debi, I want to start with you. What made you get involved in the first place working at Dream City Church? You are the Civic Engagement Director, which is something that we've talked about most churches don't have.
Yes.
So talk about a little bit about your background and how you got involved and got here.
Yeah, so I realized early on after I came to know the Lord and after I started having kids that I did not know anything at all about civics. I realized that there were things that were impacting my life, and I didn't feel like the news was telling me the truth. And this was back before, fake news was a term, but I just started doing my own research and my own investigation on different topics. And in 2006, I was just involved on the political end of it, not at the church, and was helping with a campaign, and both with a governor campaign and also with a ballot initiative that both failed at the ballot. Neither one passed through, and I was really upset. I had a baby that year. My fourth baby was born that year. It was really difficult to be involved because I had 4 little kids and a brand new baby, and I'd spent all this time invested in this process, and it just felt like it failed. And I was praying, and I really felt like the Lord spoke to me and said, "Why were you doing it in the first place?" And it was really just a heart moment for me that I realized, okay, do I want a certain outcome? Yes, 100% I do, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do. It's because this is what I should be doing. We should, as Christians, be involved, be a voice, do the right thing, and try to promote things that are biblical. And so it didn't matter in the end. That was not the ultimate goal for my action. That the results belonged to the Lord. What I did was my responsibility was to do what I was called to do in that arena.
Right.
And that kind of led to a lot of other things. And really what I started trying to do was multiply myself. So I wanted other people to do what I had done and go through that process of learning about civics, finding out how the government worked, being involved, being informed, being engaged. And so I just started sharing that with people at the church, people that were in my sphere of influence. And it led to a whole bunch of different things, into voter registration drives, into some classes, into some breakout sessions at pastors' conferences for other pastors, just a lot of activity, which led eventually to now where I'm the director of civic engagement here at Dream City, and we're able to do the podcast and do all of those things. It's been a process, but it just started really with that moment with God.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I think you said a couple of really key things about you wanting to help other people go through the process that you went through. And I had kind of a different approach. I didn't care for a long time. And, it's funny because it's something that sometimes you need a wake-up call, right? To kind of say, oh, this is something that I should pay attention to. And something that I have always cared about is we have a learned helplessness in America, where we are used to blindly relying on other people to take care of a lot of things that we really have the responsibility to take care of ourselves. And for me, it was like when COVID happened and all of these things started shutting down. And my first question was, who's allowed to do that to me?
Right.
Like, who is allowed to shut down the park and say, I can't work out at the park? Who's allowed to say that we're going to shut down these buildings and I'm not allowed to go in them, right? And so you had a much more noble beginning than I did. But it's interesting that, and I think a lot of people have been waking up the last 3, 4, 5 years to all of this, to the idea that who has control over this? And
Right.
so once you
and
realize,
understanding how much control they actually have too. That's something that I feel
Yes.
like that whole era brought out was people had no idea how much control the government could have over your life and your day-to-day what you could do and what you couldn't do and how you lived your life. It really opened people's eyes, I think.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, why would I get involved if you're not bothering me? Right? Like what is the purpose of me getting involved in local governments when I don't care about that? That's what a lot of people's stance, right? Is it has nothing to do with me. I'm not a political person, or I don't care about X, Y, and Z. Just leave me alone and let me do what I'm going to do.
Right.
But the problem is, as you just said, is that government does have a lot more authority than a lot of times they should because of the lack of people being involved.
Right.
So because you don't want to be involved, now we have government overstepping, and now you're mad they're overstepping, but you've never said anything to keep them in their place.
Right.
So it's a very important piece of that. So
Yeah.
let's talk about why Christians particularly should be involved in civics. I want to get into, because this is a big thing within churches across the nation where they say, keep the state out of church. We don't need to talk about politics in the church.
Mm-hmm.
The church is separate. The church does their own thing. So where is our duty, and why should Christians be involved in civics?
Yeah, so a lot of people think that there is supposed to be a separation of church and state, and I'm not going to get into all the detail of it. You can look it up, but that is not actually in any of our documents. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. That phrase was in a letter that was written, it was a letter. And the intent of it was that the government should not be telling the church what to do. Not that the church shouldn't be influencing the government, but that the government should not be influencing the church.
Right.
So that's a big key issue, that there was no separation of church and state. For years and years, the church did have influence. I mean, in the Revolutionary War, we saw it in civil rights movement in the 60s, in all kinds of arenas, with slavery, with getting women the right to vote. The churches were involved in those. The Quakers were super involved in a lot of those things. So you had pastors speaking from the pulpit about why the Revolutionary War should be happening, why they needed to stand up to England. There's a long history of the church and of pastors being involved in that. And it's also biblical. There's a lot of biblical references about the people of God being influencing the government.
Right. So that's kind of the first foundational piece, is Christians are called to respect whatever it is that God institutes and ordains, right? Mm-hmm. So what type of scripture do we have to back that up?
Yeah, and so sometimes they use that as Christians who don't want the church to be involved will say that, we're supposed to just obey these earthly authorities. Well, yes, we're supposed to respect them,
right.
But there are some very specific places in Scripture where it talks about confronting those government entities if they're not doing what was right. There's several places in Proverbs where it talks about when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when a wicked man rules, the people groan. That's Proverbs 29:2. And places where it talks about, this is one that Charlie Kirk likes to use all the time, that seek the peace of the city where I've caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for its peace. In its peace you will have peace. And it's interesting because it says and pray. So the first part was not about praying, it was seeking the peace. It's doing something to seek the peace of the city.
Right.
But really one of the ones that's really interesting is Jeremiah was talking when God was ordaining Jeremiah to do his work, telling him what he was doing. He says specifically, Jeremiah 1:10, it says, "See, I have this day set you, Jeremiah, over the nations and over the kingdoms, to root out and to pull down, to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant." And it says, look, I give you the authority to tell nations. This was in another version. It says, I give you the authority to tell nations and kingdoms what will happen to them. You will pull some of them out of the ground like a plant and its roots, and you will knock down and destroy some of them. You will bring an end to their power, but you will build up other nations and make them strong. So he was very clearly telling Jeremiah that he had the authority, the spiritual authority, to declare things over countries and over nations, over leaders. And then there's lots of stories in the Bible about people interacting with the government, with Joseph, Nehemiah, Mordecai and Esther, Daniel, the 3 Hebrew children, Moses, Elijah. They all had interactions with the government. But one of my favorite ones is from in Acts, and it was Paul and Silas. We all know the story of when they were thrown in jail and the earthquake happened and the jail shook. Well, the story before that and after that, excuse me, was that they had a girl that was prophesying, like she was into divination. She was a psychic, basically. And she got saved following Paul and Silas around. And then the people that owned her, this slave, were losing money because she was no longer doing this work for them. Mm-hmm. And so they had Paul and Silas thrown in jail and beaten. And nothing, there was no process to that. They weren't given due process, whatever was due process in that time. And then the government tried to come and just sort of let them go quietly and let them go. And Paul was like, no, I am a Roman citizen. You did this unjustly, and you're going to come officially and make it right, was basically what he told him in Acts 16. It's an interesting story. And so he used his civil rights, his own rights, and asserted them against the government who was abusing their power against him. Right. So, I mean, that's a lot of what we talked about just a minute ago, is that we do have the authority and the right. And that was New Testament, right? That's not Old Testament, that's New Testament. This is Paul. Yeah,
and that's, I mean, everything you're saying implies that all of these citizens and people are already engaged in their government.
Yeah.
That they know their leaders, they're talking to their leaders, and they know their rights. Yeah. And so if people in the Bible know their rights, is it not just as important that people today know their rights?
Yeah.
It's very important, because how do we address issues that we see going on in culture and when people are wronged if we don't know the laws that surround that?
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing. So to just first establish that the Bible is full of stories that are people interacting with government and leadership and how to do that.
And holding office.
Yeah, holding office and holding people accountable. All of those types of things are stories throughout the Bible that help guide us on how should we be interacting with government today. So on this, and kind of why we're talking about this, we have an astounding amount of Christians that do not vote.
Yeah.
And right now we have 40 million Christians that don't vote, 15 million that are not registered, right?
That's just insane.
So that's a huge number of people who are self-proclaimed Christians, and they say, you know what, it's just not my thing. It's just not what I do. So let's talk a little bit about why Christians should vote and why that's so important.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I've said for years is, again, going back to this, is that there's a very clear pattern in Kings and Chronicles of when the king was righteous, the country prospered, the people were doing better. And when the king was bad, the people suffered for it.
Right.
And those in Israel, they didn't have any say-so of who was leading them, right? They didn't have, the king was by, God placed kings in place, or they were by birthright. We are electing, we're choosing our leaders. And so if we are either ignoring that and not participating in that, or we are choosing people that we don't know what they stand for, or that we do know and we just don't care that they have issues on abortion or on religious liberties or things that are clearly biblical, it's like saying, please lead my state into sin. Please lead my country into sin, right? That we can't, how can we expect God to bless us as a city, as a nation, if we are putting people in place that have wickedness in there? I mean, and granted, nobody is perfect, right? No matter who they are, they're going to have issues. But I mean, David was a mess, right? He had all kinds of issues, but it was what his heart was. God said he was a man after his own heart, even though he had committed adultery and he'd murdered and, had all of these things that were going on in his life, but because we all sin.
Right.
So none of us is perfect. And that's the same with our leaders. We're not going to have anybody that is Jesus, right? Nobody's going to have that level of moral clarity, but we should be picking people that are going to stand for things that are right. Because even in the Bible, some of the kings, Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and people who were wicked, they did the right thing because they had influence from in certain circumstances, they did the right thing because of the influence of the church, because of the influence of people who followed God.
Yeah. And all throughout the Bible, God uses people
Right.
who have been terrible people, who have sinned, who have clearly gone against God. But at some point, just like you're saying, along the way, they get that wisdom, that discernment, that guidance, and they're able to lead a nation. They're able to lead. So I think that's a really important piece, that we see people voting so often on how a candidate makes them feel. Right. And that is just the truth. If it's they make me feel good, so I'm going to vote for them, or I don't like them, so I'm not going to vote for them.
Right.
And exactly what you're saying is we have to look at the objective truth of what are they going to stand for when it comes to the laws that they put into place, the things that they prioritize.
The people that they appoint.
Right.
Right.
Right. So when we are voting and when we're talking about voting, you cannot vote based on how you feel about somebody. You cannot vote based on somebody's past sins. We just talked about this. You are a sinner. I am a sinner. We all have things. We've all fallen short, right? Mm-hmm. So how can you now look at politicians and say, oh, well, guess what? You're supposed to be perfect.
Right.
I mean, you see people do this on X all the time. They're like, pull up some sort of record from 20 years ago, and they're like, did you know that this person? And I'm like, oh my God, but it's why people don't like to get involved in this civic space, because there's a lot of drama attached to it.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go to the next part here is we want to talk about what churches can and can't do, because we know that at Dream City, we have an amazing civics ministry. We're really excited about everything that's happening here, but other churches are wanting to do these types of things. So we want to lay out kind of what churches can and can't do. So let's kind of go through these one by one and talk about them. So churches can register their members as voters.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about voter registration at churches, what we can do with that.
Yeah, so you can have nonpartisan voter registration, and nonpartisan just means that you are not telling people what party to register for.
Right.
But you're encouraging them to register to vote. You can have information even about I tell people when they're doing when they're doing voter registration tables, if you can print out, this is the one platform, this is the other platform, so you have them there if people want to look at them and make their own determination of what they're doing, which one they agree with, help them through that process of what you need to fill out, what the deadlines are, what information they have to have. They have to have their driver's license. Every state is a little bit different. Here you have to have your driver's license number on the form, things like that you are helping them through that process of what they need to do to register, completely allowed in church.
Right. So that's a great way to get some initial civic engagement, is have a voter registration table before and after your church services. Mm-hmm. And that's an easy way for people to just start thinking about it, right? Kind of what you just touched on is passing out nonpartisan voter guides, right?
Yes.
So again, that it's an objective truth. What does the Bible say about this issue? And then what does the candidate say about this issue?
Right.
Right. And so we can line up and I think I've seen some from some great organizations that say a biblical value, and then it shows the 2, 3, 4 candidates, depending on, what race we're talking about. And that's a great way for people to see where their values line up.
Yeah. And those kinds of things they're nonpartisan when they ask every candidate to answer them. Sometimes candidates will not respond to those surveys, but that's their prerogative, whether they choose to answer the questions or not. But as long as everyone had the opportunity to answer them, to be part of that the voter guide, then they're nonpartisan. And it's not telling you who to vote for. It's asking a series of questions. Or sometimes I've seen them where they're based on their voting record, if they're already in office, that they voted for these things, and this person is saying they're going to vote for these things, so that we know where they stand on those issues. Right. Because issues, you're allowed to talk about those issues at church and say, just the responses that they have to where they stand on whatever the issues that are current for that election.
Right. And the next one here is churches can invite all candidates in a race to speak, and it's okay if only one shows up. It's not about who shows up. It's about saying, hey, you're allowed to invite candidates to come and speak, and they can speak directly about specific issues and legislation like abortion, marriage, etc., about values.
Yes. Yeah. And so though that inviting candidates is something that's good for smaller churches, is a little tricky to do here because we have people come from such a broad just geographic area that it makes it difficult to include all the candidates.
Right.
But we have candidates that visit and are just introduced that, hey, this person is running for this, and we don't say anything about whether you should vote for them or not, but just give people the opportunity to meet them if they ask to come. And also, we have talked a lot about issues here. You can even, with ballot initiatives at churches, we did this back in 2008 when there was a ballot initiative going on that was very biblically based, had information about it and had signature collection at the church because it is an issue. It's nonpartisan. It's not a Republican Democrat thing. It's not a specific candidate. It's an issue.
Right.
And you're also allowed to inform people about things that are going on at the state legislature. If there's something that is really good or really bad from a biblical perspective that is being voted on, that you can tell the people in your congregation what is happening, and that is completely allowed too, because those are all issues. They're not candidates. They're not parties.
Exactly. So that goes into the couple of things that churches cannot do. And one of those is churches cannot endorse or oppose a particular candidate, right?
Right.
So churches cannot go on stage and say, this is who you need to vote for, right?
Correct. And let's just preface this with saying, because I know there's some people who are going to disagree with some of this stuff. This is according to the 501c3 laws, right? Which, whether they are in place, whether they should be there or not, that's a whole separate argument.
Right.
Because with the Johnson Amendment and all of that, those it was not properly vetted, and that should not ever have been put in the first place. However, even trying to stay within the bounds of those 501c3 rules, according to the IRS, it's not that difficult to do. It's just not telling people who to vote for,
right,
or which party to vote for. But when you are doing proper education, they're going to figure that out. I mean, and that's my heart, which was what I said before about multiplying myself. I don't even necessarily want to tell people who to vote for. I want them to be smart enough to figure it out and to know how to find those resources, to know how to research those people, and how to tell what's going on so that they are informed and equipped. That's much more important to me than having the power to tell somebody, hey, vote for this person.
Right. And that's the thing. We always want people to think for themselves. We always want people to look at it and say, okay, here's the best case scenario for who gets elected. And every family's going to be different with that. And so I totally agree with you. I never tell people who to vote for either, even on my personal stuff. I think they need to figure that out. But it is important that they understand the values, because unfortunately what happens so many times is all people have to look at is the news and the media and what they're saying about things. And unfortunately, the news and the media have taken a twist, and they're able to really manipulate a lot of people by saying this is how it is. But then when you maybe look at their voter record, it's totally different, right?
Well, and you also see, just even on the other side of things, even within, people that you agree with, right? That you have, I mean, this goes on right now. This is like a don't get me started point, but my husband has heard quite an earful, of me venting about this, not at him, but just about this topic, that you have national figures that want to endorse people in primaries in our state. It drives me crazy because they don't necessarily know. I mean, and they have the right to do it. I'm not saying that they don't have the right to do it. But a lot of times people will vote for someone just because, this high-profile person told me I should vote for this person, when they don't know. And there may be other people in that race, especially when you're talking about a primary race, that are more qualified and have been around Arizona for a long time, that if you're paying attention to what's going on in Arizona, you can know that stuff, right?
Right. Yeah. So, it's a really important piece that even if we trust other people, we never want to, even in this situation, be helpless to just say, this person told me to, so I'm just going to do it.
Do your own research, right? Yeah, that's the thing. They may be completely right, they may be completely wrong, but we have to be able to know how to find out, is that really, just because this one person says it's the best candidate may not be the case.
Right.
Yeah.
So do your own research, but if you can, wherever you're at, whoever's listening, if you can get your church engaged in civics, if you can get voter registration going, if you can get, nonpartisan voter guides, these are all really, really good and really important things to have at your church. Debi, do you have any final thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts, but I think we're probably good on this topic.
Yes.
And there's a lot of other education-related things that you can do where you can bring in people. We've done this here, right? Talking about specific issues, about school choice, about abortion, about whatever a topic is. Those are all things that are also allowed in church because you're talking, again, about issues and you're educating people. You're not pushing a specific party or a specific, and telling people how they can get involved beyond voting. We've done a lot of that, of encouraging people to become precinct committeemen, poll watchers, things like that. Well, we can talk about that on another episode, but those are all things that are good to encourage within your church to just get people equipped and informed and engaged so that they can go out and be a voice and have that, what we were talking about with the biblical authority that we have to go into all the world and preach the gospel, and to have that be salt and light in every arena, not just in the church walls, but outside in the community.
Exactly. And that's why we were given the armor of God, so that we could stand, right? Mm-hmm. So that we could stand in truth. We could stand with everything that we need to face all of the attacks from the enemy, to face anything that comes against us. So I think it's important that when we're talking about faith, that we actually practice it. Mm-hmm. We don't just say, oh, have faith, oh, believe, oh, just trust God. It's like, yeah, but there has to be all of these things. God gives us the tools to take action.
And to go out of the church walls, right? It doesn't stay in the church walls. It needs to go out, and that includes in the halls of government. We're supposed to go out into the world and make a difference. Yeah.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you for listening to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church.
You can listen to this podcast on Apple and Spotify and follow us on social media. Find all the info on the show notes. To learn more about Dream City Church, visit our website at dreamcitychurch.us. Thanks for listening.